They stood on the flight deck of the carrier Zuikaku, watching the last of their planes return from the mission over the Philippine Sea. It was June 20th, 1944, and the air group commander counted the aircraft as they landed. 18 fighters came back. He had launched 27 that morning. The dive bombers were worse. Of the 27 Yokosuka D-4Y Suisei dive bombers that had taken off at dawn, 11 returned. The torpedo bombers, the pride of Japan's naval aviation, suffered similarly. 14 Nakajima B-6N Tenzan aircraft had departed. 6 came back. The mathematics were simple and devastating. Zuikaku had sent 71 aircraft on the strike. 35 returned. Half the air group was gone. Not damaged, not scattered, simply gone. Shot down over the American fleet or lost in the vast Pacific, trying to find their way home with fuel tanks. Running dry. This was not supposed to happen. The Zuikaku was one of Japan's most modern carriers, a veteran of Pearl Harbor, of the Indian Ocean raids, of the Coral Sea, and the Eastern Solomons. Her air group consisted of the best pilots Japan could provide at this stage of the war. They had trained for months. They knew their aircraft. They understood carrier operations as well as any naval aviators in the world. But they had just discovered something that would fundamentally alter their understanding of the war they were fighting. It was not a discovery about tactics or weapons or even courage. It was a discovery about mathematics, about industrial capacity, about what it meant to wage carrier warfare against an opponent whose entire operational philosophy was built on assumptions Japan had never considered. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The American carriers they had attacked that morning were different from anything in Japanese experience. The officers who had survived the strike and made it back to Zuikaku reported something that seemed impossible. The American task force had more carriers than intelligence had predicted. Each carrier launched more aircraft than seemed reasonable for a ship of that size, and when Japanese pilots shot down American planes, more appeared. The Americans seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of aircraft and pilots. One fighter pilot, a veteran with over 2 years of combat experience, reported to the air group commander that he had counted the aircraft on one American carrier's deck while making his attack approach. He had counted more than 80 planes visible, with more certainly in the hangars below. He knew this was impossible. Carriers could not operate with such numbers. The deck space alone made it unfeasible. Yet he had seen it with his own eyes. The air group commander listened to these reports with growing concern. He understood what they meant, even if he could not, yet accept the implications. Japan's carriers operated with air groups of 63 to 75 aircraft, depending on the ship and the mission. This was the standard, developed through years of experience and refined through combat. It represented the optimal balance between the number of aircraft a carrier could handle and the effectiveness of those aircraft in combat operations. The Americans, it seemed, had rejected this entire framework. They had built carriers that could operate with 90 or more aircraft, and they had done something even more significant. They had created a system where those 90 aircraft were not the full extent of the carrier's air power, but merely the operational component of a larger force that included reserves, replacements, and rotation capacity that Japanese carriers had never possessed. To understand what the officers aboard Zuikaku were beginning to realize, one must understand how Japanese carrier aviation had developed and why it had developed that way. The story begins not in 1944, but in the early 1930s, when Japan was building the naval air arm that would dominate the Pacific in the war's early years. Japanese naval aviation doctrine emerged from a specific philosophy: quality over quantity. The Imperial Japanese Navy believed that superior training, superior aircraft, and superior pilots would overcome numerical disadvantages. This was not merely propaganda or wishful thinking. It was a carefully considered strategic approach based on Japan's industrial limitations and its assessment of likely opponents. Japan could not match the industrial output of the United States. This was understood by every serious naval planner in Tokyo. The question was not whether Japan could build as many ships or aircraft as America, but how Japan could compete despite that disadvantage. The answer was to create an elite force of such high quality that it could defeat larger but less capable opponents. The carrier force that emerged from this thinking was formidable. By the late 1930s, Japan had developed a cadre of naval aviators who were among the best in the world. Pilot training was extraordinarily rigorous. Candidates underwent years of instruction. The washout rate was severe. Those who completed training were genuinely exceptional. The aircraft they flew reflected similar priorities. The Mitsubishi, a 6M0 fighter, which entered service in 1940, was a masterpiece of design for its intended purpose. It had extraordinary range, exceeding 1,000 miles in some configurations. It was highly maneuverable, able to outturn virtually any fighter it encountered in the war's early years. It was armed with two 20mm cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns, giving it substantial firepower. The trade-off was protection. The Zero had no armor plate protecting the pilot. It had no self-sealing fuel tanks. Japanese designers had calculated that these features added weight that reduced range and maneuverability. They chose to accept the vulnerability in exchange for performance. This decision made sense within their operational framework. Elite pilots in superior aircraft would not be hit often enough for the lack of protection to matter. Carrier design followed similar logic. Japanese carriers were built to operate air groups of specific sizes based on careful calculations of deck space, hangar capacity, maintenance requirements, and operational efficiency. A fleet carrier like Shokaku or Zuikaku, completed in 1941, was designed for an air group of 72 aircraft, 27 fighters, 27 dive bombers, and 18 torpedo bombers. This number was not arbitrary. It represented what Japanese naval architects and aviation planners determined was optimal for a ship of approximately 25,000 tons. The hangars could accommodate these aircraft with space for maintenance. The deck could launch and recover them efficiently. The ship's complement of mechanics, armourers, and support personnel could service them. The fuel and ammunition storage could sustain their operations. Everything about Japanese carrier operations was optimized for this structure. The air groups trained as units of this specific size. The tactical doctrines assumed formations built around these numbers. The maintenance schedules, the fuel calculations, the ammunition loads, all reflected this organizational principle. This system proved devastatingly effective in the war's opening phase. The Kido Butai, the Japanese carrier striking force, operated with a precision and power that shocked the world. On December 7, 1941, 6 Japanese carriers launched 353 aircraft against Pearl Harbor in 2 waves. The attack crippled the American Pacific Fleet, sinking or damaging 8 battleships and destroying 188 aircraft. The success was not just about numbers. It was about coordination, training, and execution. Japanese pilots found their targets across miles of ocean, pressed home their attacks with skill and determination, and returned to their carriers having achieved their objectives. The percentage of aircraft lost was low. The damage inflicted was catastrophic. In the months that followed, Japanese carrier aviation dominated the Pacific and Indian Oceans. In April 1942, 5 carriers of the Kido Butai raided the Indian Ocean, sinking the British carrier Hermes, 2 heavy cruisers, and numerous merchant ships. Japanese aircraft struck Ceylon, demonstrating that they could project power across vast distances with precision and overwhelming force. The aircrew who executed these operations were supremely confident, and with good reason. They had proven themselves the best carrier aviators in the world. Their aircraft were superior to most opponents they faced. Their tactics were refined through constant practice and actual combat. They believed, because their experience had taught them, that Japanese carrier aviation was invincible. This confidence extended throughout the fleet. Carrier captains trusted their air groups to execute any mission. Admirals planned operations, assuming Japanese carriers could overcome numerical disadvantages through superior quality. The entire naval strategy of the Imperial Japanese Navy rested on the premise that elite carrier air groups, properly employed, could defeat larger but less capable forces. The Doctrine had one critical assumption, built into its foundation, that losses would be sustainable. Japanese planners understood that aircraft would be shot down and pilots would be killed, but they assumed that the rate of attrition would be manageable, that the training pipeline could replace losses, and that the industrial base could provide new aircraft as needed. This assumption was reasonable based on pre-war planning. Japan had anticipated a short war in which superior forces would achieve quick victories, forcing negotiations before industrial capacity became decisive. The carrier force was designed for intense but limited operations, after which there would be time to rebuild, retrain, and prepare for the next engagement. What Japanese planners had not fully considered was what would happen in a prolonged war of attrition. They had not planned for a scenario where the training pipeline could not replace pilot losses quickly enough. They had not designed a system that could sustain carrier operations while simultaneously maintaining reserves and rotation schedules. Most critically, they had not anticipated an opponent who would approach carrier warfare with an entirely different philosophy, an opponent who would build carriers not as platforms for elite air groups of optimal size, but as floating air bases designed to launch, recover, and sustain the maximum possible number of aircraft. An opponent whose industrial capacity could support not just operational air groups, but also reserves, replacements, and rotation systems that Japanese carriers had never possessed. By June 1944, when Zuikaku's depleted air group landed after the disastrous strike on the American fleet, Japanese naval aviation was beginning to confront these realities. The system that had worked brilliantly in 1941 and 1942 was breaking down, and the officers counting returning aircraft on Zuikaku's deck were starting to understand that the Americans had built something fundamentally different, something Japanese doctrine had no answer for. The Essex class, carriers that Japanese pilots encountered in the Philippine Sea, represented a fundamentally different approach to naval aviation. Where Japanese carriers were designed around optimal air group sizes, American carriers were designed around maximum capacity. Where Japanese doctrine emphasized quality and efficiency, American doctrine emphasized overwhelming numbers and sustainability. The Essex class design began in 1942, when American naval architects received specifications for a new fleet carrier that would form the backbone of the Pacific offensive. The design parameters were ambitious. The ship would displace 27,000 tons standard, 36,000 tons fully loaded. It would be 872 feet long with a flight deck 147 feet wide, and it would carry as many aircraft as could be practically operated from a ship of that size. The number that emerged from design studies was 90 aircraft as the standard air group. This was not the maximum the ship could physically accommodate, but rather the number that could be operated efficiently in combat conditions. The actual capacity was higher. Essex-class carriers routinely carried additional aircraft in reserve, spare planes that could replace combat losses without the ship returning to port. The air group composition for an Essex-class carrier in mid-1944 typically consisted of 36 Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighters, 36 Douglas SBD, Dauntless dive bombers or Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver bombers, and 18 Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. That was 90 aircraft operational, but the hangar deck and additional deck parking could accommodate another 10 to 15 aircraft in reserve. This meant an Essex-class carrier went into battle with 100 or more aircraft available. When a fighter was shot down, another could be pulled from reserve. When a dive bomber was damaged beyond repair, it could be pushed overboard and replaced from the spare aircraft secured in the hangar. The carrier did not lose operational capacity with each loss. It maintained full strength through a reserve system Japanese carriers had never possessed. The physical design of the ship supported this capacity. The hangar deck was 640 feet long, 70 feet wide, and 17.5 feet high. This enormous space could accommodate dozens of aircraft with room for maintenance operations. Elevators connected the hangar to the flight deck, moving aircraft rapidly between levels. 3 elevators, each capable of lifting 18,000 pounds, could cycle aircraft continuously during flight operations. The flight deck itself was designed for maximum efficiency. The island superstructure was positioned on the starboard side, keeping most of the deck clear for aircraft operations. Arresting gear consisted of 9 cables stretched across the deck, any of which could stop a landing aircraft. 2. Catapults could launch aircraft from the forward deck, accelerating them to flying speed in less than 200 feet, but the most significant difference was not in the hardware. It was in the operational philosophy that the hardware enabled. American carriers operated with a rotation and replacement system that maintained combat effectiveness indefinitely. Air groups could be rotated off carriers after extended combat operations. Fresh squadrons could be brought aboard. Individual pilots could be replaced without breaking up effective units. The training pipeline supporting this, the system was immense. By 1944, the United States was producing more than 100,000 pilots per year across all services. Naval aviation alone was training thousands of carrier-qualified pilots. Training bases in Florida, Texas, California, and across the country ran continuous programs. Students flew hundreds of hours before reaching fleet squadrons. The washout rate was significant, but the throughput was so large that the fleet received a constant stream of trained aviators. Aircraft production matched this scale. Grumman's plant on Long Island produced more than 12,000 Hellcat fighters during the war. The production rate at peak was over 500 aircraft per month. When a carrier air group lost fighters in combat, replacements were available within days or weeks, not months. The industrial base could sustain combat losses that would have crippled a smaller manufacturing economy. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, which began on June 19, 1944, revealed the full extent of this disparity. The Japanese mobile fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, sortied from its bases with 9 carriers. The force included 3 fleet carriers, Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, each with air groups of approximately 75 aircraft. 6 light carriers accompanied them with smaller air groups. The total Japanese carrier strength was approximately 450 aircraft. The American Fifth Fleet, commanded by Admiral Raymond Spruance, had 15 carriers. 7 were Essex-class fleet carriers, each with air groups exceeding 90 aircraft. 8 were Independence-class light carriers with smaller but still substantial air groups. The total American carrier strength exceeded 900 aircraft operational, with additional reserves aboard each ship. Japanese commanders knew they were outnumbered, but they believed they had advantages that would compensate. Their aircraft had longer range, allowing them to strike American carriers from distances where American planes could not respond. They could use land-based aircraft from Guam and other Mariana Islands to supplement carrier strikes, and they retained confidence in the superior skill of their pilots. Admiral Ozawa's plan was to launch strikes from maximum range, damage or sink American carriers, then close for decisive surface engagement. Japanese battleships and cruisers, including the massive Yamato and Musashi, would finish what the airstrikes began. It was a sound plan based on pre-war doctrine and assumptions about carrier warfare. The first Japanese strike launched at approximately 8:30 in the morning on June 19th. 69 aircraft from Ozawa's carriers headed toward the American fleet. They never had a chance. American radar detected the incoming strike at great range. Fighter directors aboard American carriers vectored Hellcats to intercept. The Japanese formation, strung out during the long approach, was torn apart by coordinated attacks from multiple fighter divisions. Of the 69 aircraft in the first strike, fewer than 30 reached the American fleet. Those that did faced intense anti-aircraft fire from ships equipped with radar-directed gunnery and proximity-fused shells. The proximity fuse, a technology Japanese forces had never encountered, detonated anti-aircraft shells when they came within lethal range of an aircraft, dramatically increasing the effectiveness of defensive fire. One Japanese pilot who survived the attack and was later captured described the experience to American interrogators. He said he had never seen so many fighters. They appeared from different altitudes and directions. His formation was broken up before reaching the target. He made his attack approach alone, watching other aircraft falling around him. The anti-aircraft fire was more intense than anything he had experienced. The shells seemed to explode near aircraft even when they did not directly hit. He released his bomb without seeing if it struck anything, then turned for home, pursued by American fighters for miles. The second Japanese strike, consisting of 109 aircraft, fared no better. American fighters intercepted it farther from the fleet. The slaughter was methodical. Japanese pilots found themselves outnumbered, outperformed by the Hellcat fighters, and unable to execute coordinated attacks. The third and fourth strikes suffered similar fates. By the end of the day, Japan had launched approximately 375 carrier aircraft in 4 major strikes. Fewer than 100 returned. American losses were minimal. 23 aircraft shot down in combat, most by Japanese fighters, rather than anti-aircraft fire. The disparity was staggering. American pilots, many of them fresh from training with only months of experience, had destroyed veteran Japanese air groups. The battle would be remembered in American naval history as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, but for Japanese, carrier aviation, it was something far more devastating. It was the moment when all assumptions about carrier warfare proved false. The quality of Japanese pilots had not compensated for numerical inferiority. The longer range of Japanese aircraft had not provided a decisive advantage. The skill and courage of the air crews had not overcome the material disparity. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Aboard Zuikaku, the air group commander compiled his after-action report in "The Hours After the Battle." The numbers told a story that required no interpretation. The carrier had launched 71 aircraft. 35 returned, 36 were lost, representing more than half the air group. Among the dead were some of Japan's most experienced naval aviators, men with years of training and multiple combat deployments. These losses could not be replaced. Not quickly, not at all in any meaningful time frame. The Japanese naval aviation training pipeline in mid-1944 was producing perhaps several hundred pilots per year, and the quality of training had declined as experienced instructors were pulled to fill combat losses. The time required to train a carrier-qualified pilot had been compressed from years to months, sacrificing skill for speed and still failing to meet demand. Aircraft losses could theoretically be replaced more quickly than pilots, but even here Japan faced insurmountable problems. Japanese aircraft production in 1944 was approximately 28,000 planes across all types. American production the same year exceeded 96,000 aircraft. The ratio was more than 3-to-1, and that understated the disparity because American aircraft were generally more capable, more durable, and supported by a supply chain that could keep them operational. The Zuikaku could not simply receive replacement aircraft and pilots and return to full combat effectiveness. The ship needed to return to port. The surviving air group needed rest and reorganization. New pilots needed to be integrated and trained in carrier operations. New aircraft needed to be delivered, assembled, and tested. The entire process would take weeks at minimum, more likely months. Meanwhile, the American carriers that had fought in the Philippine Sea remained operational. They had lost aircraft and pilots, but nowhere near enough to reduce their combat effectiveness. The Essex-class carriers returned to their task groups, took aboard replacement aircraft from logistics ships, integrated replacement pilots from the training pipeline, and prepared for the next operation. The time from battle to full readiness was measured in days, not weeks or months. This was the fundamental difference that Japanese naval officers were beginning to understand. American carriers were designed as part of a system. The ships themselves were merely platforms. The real strength was in the integrated logistics, training, and industrial capacity that kept those platforms continuously effective. An Essex-class carrier was never operating in isolation. It was connected to a network of support vessels, training bases, aircraft factories, and personnel pipelines that sustained its operations indefinitely. Japanese carriers, by contrast, were individual assets. When a Japanese carrier's air group was destroyed, the ship's combat effectiveness dropped to near zero. It had to withdraw from combat, return to port, and undergo a lengthy process of reconstitution. During that time, it contributed nothing to the fleet's strength, and because Japan had relatively few carriers and limited capacity to replace losses, each ship withdrawn for reconstitution represented a significant reduction in total combat power. The night after the battle, Admiral Ozawa's remaining carriers withdrew westward, away from the American fleet. They had failed to damage the enemy significantly. They had lost the majority of their aircraft and a substantial portion of their trained pilots. 2 fleet carriers, Taiho and Shokaku, had been sunk by American submarines during the battle, further reducing Japanese carrier strength. The mobile fleet that retreated was a shadow of the force that had sortied with such confidence just days before. American forces pursued, and on June 20th launched their own strikes against the retreating Japanese fleet. The attacks sank 1 carrier and damaged several others, but the more significant outcome was that they demonstrated American offensive capability. The Essex-class carriers launched strikes at extreme range in late afternoon, knowing their aircraft would have to return in darkness. Pilots found the Japanese fleet, pressed home their attacks, then navigated back to their carriers in the dark over hundreds of miles of ocean. Most made it back. Those who didn't were rescued by American submarines and destroyers, positioned along the return route specifically for that purpose. This level of operational sophistication, this ability to launch complex strikes and recover aircraft under difficult conditions while maintaining multiple task groups and coordinating with submarines and surface forces, reflected a maturity in carrier operations that Japanese forces could no longer match. The Americans had not just built more carriers and produced more aircraft, they had created an entire system of naval aviation that operated at a scale and complexity Japan could not replicate. The Japanese carriers that survived the Philippine Sea returned to their bases with depleted air groups and shattered confidence. Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack force, limped back to Japan with fewer than 24 operational aircraft. The ship that had once struck fear across the Pacific was now barely combat capable. The crew understood what had happened even if they could not fully articulate it. They had been defeated not by superior tactics or better pilots, but by a system they had no capacity to match. Efforts to rebuild Japanese carrier air groups in the months following the battle revealed the full extent of the crisis. The training bases in Japan were producing pilots, but the quality had declined precipitously. Where pre-war training had required years and produced genuinely elite aviators, wartime training now compressed the entire curriculum into months. Pilots reached fleet squadrons with minimal flight hours, virtually no combat training. They could fly their aircraft, barely, but they lacked the skills needed to survive against experienced American pilots in superior fighters. The disparity was quantifiable. A Japanese naval aviator who completed training in 1941 had typically accumulated between 600 and 800 flight hours before joining a fleet squadron. By late 1944, new pilots arrived with fewer than 200 hours total flight time. Some had less than 100 hours. They did not know how to navigate over open ocean. They struggled with carrier landings even in good conditions. They had never practiced coordinated strike tactics or experienced combat maneuvering. These inadequately trained pilots were expected to fly against American aviators who averaged 300 to 500 flight hours in training, plus additional experience in fleet squadrons before seeing combat. The American pilots had practiced gunnery extensively. They had trained in their specific aircraft type for months. They had studied combat reports and learned tactics proven effective against Japanese aircraft. Many had combat experience from earlier campaigns. The aircraft themselves compounded the disadvantage. By late 1944, the Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, once the most feared aircraft in the Pacific, was thoroughly obsolete. American Hellcats outperformed Zeros in nearly every category except turning radius. The Hellcat was faster, could dive more steeply, climbed better at high altitude, and was far more durable. It had armor protection for the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks that prevented catastrophic fires, and heavier armament. In head-to-head combat between competent pilots, the Hellcat held every advantage. Japan had developed newer aircraft designs. The Kawanishi N-1K Shiden fighter and the Mitsubishi A-7M Reppu were potentially competitive with American fighters, but production of these advanced designs was limited by material shortages, manufacturing capacity constraints, and constant American bombing of Japanese industrial facilities. The aircraft that actually reached combat units were predominantly Zeros and other older types that stood little chance against late-war American fighters. The carrier force itself continued to deteriorate. Zuikaku, after months of reconstruction, put to sea in October 1944 for the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Her air group consisted of fewer than 30 aircraft, and most of the pilots were recent graduates of the abbreviated training program. The ship served primarily as a decoy, drawing American carrier strikes away from Japanese surface forces attempting to attack the American landing beaches at Leyte. The decoy mission succeeded. American carrier aircraft found Zuikaku and the other Japanese carriers on October 25. The attacks were overwhelming. Zuikaku absorbed multiple bomb and torpedo hits. The ship's crew fought fires and flooding for hours, but the damage was too extensive. In the afternoon, the order came to abandon ship. Zuikaku rolled over and sank, taking with her the last direct connection to the carrier force that had attacked Pearl Harbor nearly 3 years earlier. The other Japanese carriers at Leyte Gulf fared no better. Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda were all sunk by American carrier aircraft. The Japanese carrier force, which had once dominated the Pacific, effectively ceased to exist as a combat arm. Japan still had carriers in home waters, but they had no aircraft to fly from them and no trained pilots to fly those aircraft even if they existed. The ships sat at anchor, useless, awaiting the final American assault on the home islands. While Japanese carrier aviation collapsed, American carrier operations reached their peak effectiveness. By early 1945, the Fast Carrier Task Force operated with a level of sophistication that would have seemed impossible just 3 years earlier. Task Force 58. The designation for the fast carriers in the Pacific routinely operated 15 to 20 carriers in multiple task groups conducting simultaneous operations across thousands of square miles of ocean. The Essex-class carriers formed the core of this force. By war's end, 17 Essex-class ships had been commissioned, with more under construction. Each carried air groups exceeding 90 aircraft. The total embarked air power available to American carrier forces in the Pacific by mid-1945 exceeded 1,500 operational aircraft, with additional reserves and replacement pools. These carriers struck targets across the Japanese home islands with impunity. In February 1945, Task Force 58 raided Tokyo itself, launching strikes that destroyed hundreds of aircraft on the ground and in the air. In March and April, the carriers supported the invasion of Okinawa, maintaining continuous air superiority over the island and surrounding waters for months. Japanese kamikaze attacks damaged several carriers, but none were sunk, and damaged ships were quickly replaced by undamaged vessels from the reserve. The operational tempo was relentless. Carriers would operate for weeks or months, launch thousands of sorties, then withdraw for brief rest periods before returning to combat. The logistics system supporting these operations was vast. Fleet oilers refueled ships at sea. Ammunition ships replenished depleted magazines. Aircraft carriers themselves could be resupplied with replacement aircraft delivered by escort carriers or even flown directly from island bases. The entire system was designed for sustained operations at maximum intensity. Individual Essex-class carriers demonstrated remarkable resilience. USS Franklin was hit by 2 bombs while operating off Japan in March 1945. The bombs penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar, igniting fueled and armed aircraft. The resulting fires and explosions killed over 800 men and nearly destroyed the ship. But Franklin did not sink. Damage control parties fought the fires. The crew saved their ship and brought it home for repairs. Within months, had the war continued, Franklin would have returned to combat. This durability was built into the design. Essex-class carriers had multiple firefighting systems, compartmentalized damage control, redundant systems for critical functions, and structural strength that allowed them to absorb tremendous damage and remain afloat. Japanese carriers, by contrast, were more vulnerable to catastrophic damage. At the Battle of Midway in June 1942, 4 Japanese fleet carriers were sunk in a single day, each lost to relatively few bomb hits that ignited fires which could not be controlled. The contrast extended to every aspect of carrier operations. American carriers had better radar, allowing earlier detection of incoming attacks. They had more effective anti-aircraft defenses, including the proximity-fused shells that devastated Japanese airstrikes. They had superior damage control, training and equipment. They had backup systems and redundancies that kept them functional even when damaged, and they had the industrial base to repair damage quickly and return ships to service. But perhaps the most significant advantage was in personnel management. American carrier crews were rotated after extended combat deployments. Men who had served through multiple campaigns were sent home for rest, reassignment, or to serve as instructors for new crews. This rotation prevented the exhaustion and deterioration of effectiveness that came from prolonged combat operations. It also ensured that experienced personnel were available to train new crews, spreading combat knowledge throughout the fleet. Japanese carriers had no such rotation system. Crews remained with their ships until the ships were sunk or until the crew members were killed or wounded. Experience was concentrated in a shrinking pool of survivors rather than distributed across an expanding force. When experienced carriers like Zuikaku were sunk, their accumulated knowledge died with them. There was no institutional memory, no system for capturing and transmitting lessons learned, no way to ensure that the mistakes that killed one crew would not kill the next. When the war ended in August 1945, the disparity in carrier forces was absolute. The United States had 99 aircraft carriers in commission, including 17 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, and numerous escort carriers. The total embarked air power exceeded several thousand aircraft. Japan had no operational carriers remaining. The few that survived the war sat in harbors with no fuel, no aircraft, and no trained crews. The human cost of this disparity was staggering. Japan had trained approximately 15,000 naval aviators during the war. The vast majority were dead. Some died in combat, shot down by American fighters or anti-aircraft fire. Others died in training accidents as the quality of instruction declined, and inexperienced students flew aircraft they barely understood. Still others died in kamikaze attacks, deliberately crashing their aircraft into American ships in desperate attempts to stem the tide of defeat. The American naval aviation training pipeline had produced over 60,000 carrier-qualified pilots during the war. Many saw combat, some were killed, but the system ensured that losses could be replaced, that experience could be preserved and transmitted, and that the force grew stronger rather than weaker as the war progressed. By war's end, American carrier air groups contained both experienced combat veterans and well-trained newcomers, a balanced force that could sustain operations indefinitely. The technology differential told a similar story. American factories had produced over 12,000 Hellcat fighters, over 7,000 Corsair fighters, over 9,000 Avenger torpedo bombers, and thousands of dive bombers and other aircraft types. These were not obsolete designs kept in production due to inability to develop better aircraft. They were effective, modern combat aircraft that dominated their Japanese counterparts. And when even better designs became available, the production system could retool and begin manufacturing the new types within months. Japan's aircraft production, constrained by material shortages and increasingly disrupted by American bombing, never exceeded 30,000 aircraft in any single year across all types. The quality of construction declined as the war progressed. Aircraft were built with substitute materials when standard alloys were unavailable. Quality control suffered as experienced workers were conscripted and replaced by untrained laborers. Many aircraft that reached operational units were mechanically unreliable, wearing out quickly or failing in flight. The carrier air groups that had struck Pearl Harbor in December 1941 represented the culmination of decades of training, development, and operational refinement. They were genuinely elite forces, arguably the best carrier aviators in the world at that moment. But they were a finite resource, expended in a war of attrition against an opponent whose system could sustain losses indefinitely while growing stronger. The officers aboard Zuikaku, who counted returning aircraft after the Philippine Sea strike, understood this, even if they could not fully articulate it. They saw the mathematics. They knew what it meant. Their air group had been cut in half in a single day. The Americans had lost aircraft too, but nowhere near enough to matter. The American carriers would be back at full strength within days. Zuikaku would require months to reconstitute, if it could be done at all. This was not a story about courage or skill or tactical brilliance, though all of those mattered. This was a story about industrial systems, about training pipelines, about logistics networks, about the capacity to sustain complex military operations at scale over time. The Japanese carrier force had been designed for a short war of decisive battles. The American carrier force had been designed for a long war of sustained operations. When the war proved to be the latter rather than the former, the outcome was predetermined. The 72 aircraft that Japanese fleet carriers operated represented careful optimization for efficiency and effectiveness within Japan's industrial constraints. The 90-plus aircraft that Essex-class carriers operated, with reserves waiting to replace losses, represented a different philosophy entirely, overwhelming capacity sustained by industrial might. The irony was that both sides had built exactly what they intended. Japan had created an elite force of exceptional quality. America had created a mass force of overwhelming quantity, backed by inexhaustible resources. In the Pacific War, quantity backed by adequate quality proved decisively superior to quality limited by insufficient quantity. The final carrier battle of the Pacific War was not a battle at all. It was American carriers launching strikes against targets in Japan, while Japanese carriers sat immobilized in port, their decks empty, their purpose extinguished. The system that had begun the war with such confidence and such genuine capability had been ground down by an opponent whose approach to carrier warfare was fundamentally different and, in the context of industrial total war, fundamentally superior. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.